Hello, hello. My name is Dr. Jamila Lyiscott, aka Dr. J, and I don't got a lot of time with you today, so I'm gonna just jump right in. I want to spend some time today I'm just so grateful to have the opportunity to be a part of this very necessary collective work and labor in the history and legacy and honor of the great Marcus Garvey. And I want to just take a few minutes today to share with you on the topic. Your teaching might be more aligned with colonialism than you realize. And I understand that all of you attending here may not be teachers, but I'm spending my time trying to think about the complicity of our educational system in reinforcing and continuing the painful and heinous legacy of colonialism alongside the racial injustices that we're also well aware of. So let's jump in again, because I don't have a lot of time, and I'm looking forward to expanding some more with you all in the question and answer section. So first of all, we know the social moment that we're embedded in across the African diaspora in this moment is just fraught with evidence about anti-Blackness, about violence against Black lives. And we know that when we contextualize and historicize these realities, it follows, right? It makes sense. What's happening in this moment with police brutality in America and across the world, and resonant issues throughout the diaspora, is not divorced from the realities that we have existed in for the past 400, 500 years. And so I want to just invite us into a reflection on that, knowing that that frames the conversation that I'm trying to have today. Most people know me from my TED Talk, 3 Ways to Speak English, where I really talk about and assert the fact that I speak 3 varieties of English that come from my Caribbean American background, that come from my life in the hood. Like, I speak African American English, and then I speak the English that's been imposed upon me in schooling and the academy. And I bring this up, I evoke this just to say that an assertion of an affirmation and sustaining the 3 ways that I engage in languaging the world is one way that I continue to disrupt anti-Blackness. And that's going to frame some of the conversation I'm having with you today. So first of all, colonialism, this ain't the deep dive master's class. Like, just very briefly, you see here on the left the Treaty of Berlin in 1880s, where we know that European powers like really sat down and thought strategically and intentionally about how they would ravage the continent of Africa through imperialism and colonialism. And so what I just want to highlight here is that colonialism is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. Far more complex than that, but that's what we're going to deal with today in order to hold accountable the ways that our systems of education continue to threaten continue to sustain colonialism in order to facilitate the racism that we are all navigating today, that our brother and our ancestor Marcus Garvey fought against. And so when we think about education for self-determination and self-actualization, it's really this kind of self-awareness and social awareness about how to undo this that becomes important. And so for that reason, I want to acknowledge that decolonial, post-colonial and anti-colonial activism and scholarship and engagement have been theorized heavily and enacted heavily. And these are very different. I'm not going to hone in on one today. What I'm going to say is that all of these do the work of addressing and disrupting and seeking to abolish what has been what has happened in the wake and aftermath of the colonial encounter. And so what I'm going to do is really talk about 3 features that are the colonial logic that I think shape the colonial logic that saturates our experiences with schooling. I'm a professor of social justice education. I've been in the field of education literally all my life because I've been a student, and I spent some time in my teenage years just working with community-based organizations that challenge traditional notions of what schooling can look like, and then move to think about the relationship between communities and spaces of schooling. So I've been doing this work for some time. especially as it relates to engaging deeply with communities and out of school spaces that help us to break and challenge and reshape the lodging that schooling has embraced. And so these are the three things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about them, and I'm going to talk about what are some of the things that we can do to disrupt them and that have emerged out of my own research and practice. The first is the first feature of this colonial logic that I want to talk about is the breaking of home culture with school culture. The second one is the indoctrination of colonial ideologies as normal, superior, and civil alongside the fetishization, co-opting, and exploitation of indigenous identities. And that's a mouthful, that's a lot of jargon. I'm gonna make it plain. And then the last thing I'm gonna focus on is the erasing of our names. So let's get started. The breaking of home culture with school culture, I turn to the work of the amazing Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who shares his time living in colonial Kenya, right? Like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is a scholar, a brilliant scholar right now, he speaks about in this book, Decolonizing the Mind, the fact that he was living in Kenya before it was colonized, right? And he says that before colonization, the language of the school and the language of the community were one, but then came a colonial education. And what he speaks about is the way that colonial education was intentional about breaking the home culture and the school culture, particularly through language in many ways. But the thing that is evocative for me is this notion of language. So he says, like, one of the most humiliating things that could happen is that you would be caught speaking your own mother tongue within the very vicinity of the school. And then you would be punished, severely punished, to the point where you would either be physically beaten, or you would have to wear a sign around your neck that said, "I am stupid," or "I am a donkey." And what's important to know about that is that the colonizers knew that in order to effectively subjugate the people, they needed to make sure that this breaking of home culture and colonial culture was affected, right? So he says in the book, Berlin of 1884 was affected through the sword and the bullet, but the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. The bullet was the means of physical subjugation. Language was the means of spiritual subjugation. And this quote just brings to light the way that the space of schooling was used to perpetuate colonial logic, to say, like, you are going to be inundated and permeated with the colonial language. And one thing that we need to know about language is that language is a living thing, right? It's not just words. So language, if you reflect on your own home languages, or reflect on your primary tongues, even if you don't speak multiple languages, there are probably words and phrases that feel close to your history and identity. You'll know that language is saturated with history, with politics, with culture, with identity. So when we manipulate language, we're manipulating just more than words, right? And so for the colonizers to know, like, I'm going to punish you for engaging in your own linguistic practice in order to engage this kind of like psychic violence, where you associate the language of the colonizer with a certain kind of superiority and order that is distinct from what you're supposed to now conceptualize your home language with, which is largely something barbaric and that you want to stay away from, right? And this is the kind of evil that I'm talking about, that we engage in our classrooms today, that we engage in schools today, with Black students who come into school with linguistic practices that are powerfully aligned with the West African languages of their ancestors, that have gone through the slavery and song of the people on this very land. Like we come in with these language practices, with these words, with these creolizations of who we are, and they're punished. Right? We're told that this is wrong. This is not standard English. And this is just one dynamic. We know that this is extended into the way that just Black lives, Black cultural practices, Black identities, Black ways of knowing and being are constantly corrected, controlled, and disrupted in school. And so as a way of not just like troubling up the issue, but also speaking to the power of how we need to be in conversation with combating these things, I want to offer up culturally sustaining pedagogy as a practice that I engage in to sustain who we are. Like when Black students come into the classroom, I'm worried not about them aligning with the ethos of schooling. I'm worried about honing in on and sustaining the ways of knowing, being, languages, cultural practices that they already bring as powerful and necessary to nourish the environment. And so culturally sustaining pedagogy is an approach that says we don't just have access to school spaces and then we say that we're diverse and we're doing the work, but what does it mean to sustain our identities and disrupt this institution accordingly, right? Like, half of these institutions that I'm navigating weren't even built with me in mind. And so now that I'm here, I'm not just gonna fall in line. Like, we're gonna really have to get to work. Like, my full being has to be honored. All right, I'm running out of time. So Ciphers for Justice represents some of the work that I do, just drawing on hip hop culture and other Black cultural practices, and really Black, Indigenous, and people of color, like different ways of knowing, to support young people who are activists, scholars, leaders, and sustaining these different modalities and ways of knowing as a part of doing that work to challenge schooling and the academy broadly. All right, second, because I don't got no time left, so stay with me. The indoctrination of colonial ideologies as normal, superior, and civil, alongside the fetishization, co-opting, and exploitation of Indigenous identities. And so this is going back to language. A lot of times when I have conversations about disrupting standard practice of English, I get the feedback that standard English is the language of power. And I'm like, no, standard English is the language of people in power. I can show you throughout popular culture, like the McDonald's slogan, and the way that Obama engaged in multiple language practices, like this show that's engaging, the title of this show here, She Crazy, that's engaging in a African-American linguistic practice called copula absence, the absence of the verb to be. I can show you that the language of my people, that the language practices of my people it has power. It just does not align with the people in power and the logic that we hold on to in school. And so this is the contradiction. This is the contradiction that I'm pointing to when I say alongside the fetishization, co-opting, and exploitation of Indigenous identities, because even though there is this correcting and this policing of these linguistic practices, it's still utilized and fetishized and co-opted, right? Boom. So what I want to say here is that one of the ways that we can address this is through the excavation and disruption of toxic ideologies. I absolutely don't have time to go fully into this framework for doing that. But what I do want to say is that if we are going to talk about really confronting these issues and sustaining the identities and power of Blackness and disrupting institutions, it has to happen at the ideological level. That's the very ways of knowing that we embrace, that white middle class logic, that colonial logic that frames the policies, practices, and the happenings that occur. Like, we're often on that level, right? We're like, oh, this event happened, so we're reacting. This policy exists, so let's disrupt it. And we should, but we have to understand that these things are embedded in long-standing beliefs, like enduring beliefs, like about Black disposability is an ideology. The underlying belief that Black lives are not as valuable as other people is a part of the racist colonial logic that frames this very nation and a lot of our world. So that's that. Lastly, the erasing of our names. I can't believe I'm going to get through this in 15 minutes. Yes. So the erasing of our names. What I'll say is I want to bring up Wharton Shire's beautiful poem that says, give your daughters difficult names, give your daughters names that command the full use of tongue. My name makes you want to tell me the truth. My name doesn't allow me to trust anyone that cannot pronounce it right. And I mean, this resonates with me because the thing about the colonial logic is that along with the erasing of languages and identities, there's something about the power of a name. Know that the continent of Africa was named from the outside, and nobody on the continent of Africa named it Africa, right? There's something about the power of naming and controlling and renaming, especially in colonial and settler colonial logic, right? Leave it up to America to go on the moon and put a flag down and say, now I own this land. Like, what? That logic is very colonial. It's very much about this concept of ownership that really permeates the way that we engage in schooling. Like, a lot of the students that I know and work with, especially when they come from various backgrounds, are terrified to have their own accents or to even have their own names. They have these, you know, like really rich, beautiful names from their backgrounds, their cultures, their ethnicities, and they're just like, my name's Stacy, right? Because we feel like we have to engage in these acts of erasure in order to align with the colonial logic of schooling that will only advance us if we are aligned and punish us if we dare to remain tethered to our mother cultures and mother tongues. And so just to close out, these are the three things that I say. I say sustain our identities. Like if we really gonna do this work of disrupting colonial logic, especially in education, if we're gonna be talking about education for self-determination and self-actualization, we sustaining our identities, we're disrupting toxic ideologies like Black disposability, for example, and other ideologies and collective beliefs that threaten the magic of Blackness. And we're demanding that we're called by our names. And that's very much a metaphor. It's not just about my name. You need to pronounce my name properly, yes, but you also need to pronounce my culture properly. You need to pronounce my background properly. You need to fully be able to embrace and wrap yourself around the fullness of who I am, the same way that you expect me to somehow step into a classroom and translate Tchaikovsky, and see, I can't, thank God I can't pronounce it. Look, I'm winning. Or Shakespeare, right? You ask us to wrap our tongues around that stuff, and we're demanding that in order to engage in this disruption of colonial logic that you call us by our names. Thank you. 15 minutes is never enough, but I'm looking forward to following up with you in the question and answer period. Thank you so much, and grateful again for this beautiful experience.